Alan Wake 2 presents a twisting story, one that's a convoluted mystery, altered by the otherworldly power of the supernatural dark place and the writings of Alan Wake himself. For some, the air of mystery and opaque storytelling leaves a lot to one's imagination. Making sense of it all can get pretty confusing, an entangled nightmare if you will, and we're going to try unknotting it all for you. So we're going to explain everything that happened, what it implies for the future, and everything you might have missed. That said, this is your obligatory super duper. Now's your time to leave spoiler warning for Alan Wake 2. Okay, with that out the way, let's get into it. At the end of the game, Saga Anderson and Alan Wake's tales finally intersect, and with both of them in the Dark Place, attempt to execute a plan that will stop Mr. Scratch. While Saga was first brought to Bright Falls to investigate a series of ritualistic killings, her world is quickly flipped upside down into something of a nightmare, where her entire reality begins to rewrite itself. A reality that's being changed because of Return, a story that Alan, or in this case his evil doppelganger, Mr. Scratch, is writing in order to escape the Dark Place. In Return's altered form of reality, Saga and her daughter Logan lived in the town of Watery next to Bright Falls. But in this story, Logan had drowned there years earlier, and of course that's not the reality Saga remembers. As far as she is aware, Saga never moved to Watery, she never divorced her husband David, and their daughter Logan is still alive and well. So as Return slowly starts to shift her reality into this tragic story, it becomes Saga's mission to somehow prevent it from taking over entirely and making Logan's death permanent. For that, she needs Alan to rewrite it, and she'll also need the clicker to make sure it actually happens. The clicker is a key item from the original Alan Wake. It's a light switch that was formerly part of a lamp, Alan's angel lamp from when he was a child, that manifests itself in the Dark Place during Alan's portion of Alan Wake 2, and that he uses to manipulate his reality. When used in conjunction with a story or other piece of art that the Dark Place brings to life, the clicker can render permanent changes to reality that were created by the art itself. If Saga uses the clicker alongside Alan's new version of Return, it can make the story's changes permanent. So in theory, this means saving her daughter, defeating the Dark Presence, and saving Alan from the Dark Place. But of course, it all goes sideways. Saga uses the clicker, and with the help of the band The Old Gods of Asgard, which is comprised of her grandfather Thor and her great-uncle Odin, try to summon Alan from the Dark Place with a song. And it works, kind of. Instead of Alan showing up right there in that moment, he shows up days earlier at another part of the story. In fact, specifically when Saga first finds him at Cauldron Lake, and she didn't just bring Alan. During his time in the Dark Place, we learn that it wasn't Mr. Scratch who was directly thwarting his efforts to edit Return in order to prevent the Dark Presence's escape. It was Alan himself, down the road, after numerous attempts to write his own escape novel, Initiation. His journey reveals to him that his wife Alice, whom he saved from the Dark Place at the end of the first game, causing his eternal entrapment there, killed herself after years of being haunted by Mr. Scratch, which Alan assumes was happening due to his continuous meddling with reality in order to escape. He confronts who he believes to be Mr. Scratch, but it's actually his past self, killing him and preventing him from finishing the edits to Return, and allowing Scratch's horror story to play out in the first place. Believing all hope to be lost, Alan gives in to the Dark Presence, and in that moment is transported to the real world thanks to Saga's meddling. As Saga realizes that Alan's arrival days prior was the result of her using the clicker in the present, Alan, now Mr. Scratch and fully consumed by the Dark Presence, shows up. Saga manages to drive the Dark Presence out of him, but it possesses her partner Casey instead. The new Mr. Scratch. Scratch steals the clicker and throws Saga into Cauldron Lake, sending her to the Dark Place. When Alan returns to the Dark Place, we get a glimpse of what Scratch means to create. It wants to take full control of reality, remaking it however it sees fit. Alan's able to find a physical copy of the book, which he can read to find out the story's ending and change it. With a copy of the book in hand, Alan returns to the writer's room, which just so happens to be above the Valhalla nursing home. This is when Wake realizes he needs a co-writer. Cue Saga Anderson. After freeing herself from a prison of doubt that the Dark Place put her in, Saga starts venturing across a version of Alan's shifting reality in the dark and gritty noir New York City, which is also where Saga can locate the Clicker. Artie the janitor, who seems to be a paranormal entity like the Dark Presence, but seemingly a more friendlier one, sends Alan to retrieve Alice's photos and put them in the shoebox, which is a pivotal setup for this moment. Saga finds the photos in the shoebox, and thanks to the power of the Dark Place, it turns Alice's photos into their literal subjects, the Clicker and the bullet made of light. Saga contacts Alan through her mind place, and together, the two of them rework the ending to return. The story will only become stronger by having Saga as a co-writer, but not without sacrifices. As Alan notes, this is a horror story, and the conventions of the genre have to be respected. It has to be true to the art, it has to be dark, and if it's inauthentic, it won't work. Scratch arrives to stop the new story, but Saga uses the Clicker to turn the story into reality. The story forces the Dark Presence out of Casey, but into Alan. Saga shoots Alan as Scratch, seemingly killing Scratch. The whole thing ends ambiguously, as Saga tries to call Logan to confirm that the story has been changed and her daughter is still alive, but we never hear if Logan picks up on the other side. Roll credits. Okay, so yeah, it's a lot. Dark, twisted, and ambiguous, as it should be, after all, to be authentic to the genre it's portraying, right? As far as we know, Saga and Casey are apparently still in the Dark Place. The bullet of light seems like it should have killed Scratch, but that's not really clear either. Alan has seemingly destroyed manifestations of the Dark Presence on 2 previous occasions, in the original Alan Wake and in Alan Wake's American Nightmare, but it keeps coming back. We also know there's more story to come, at least for Wake. Remedy announced 2 additions to the story by way of DLC expansions, titled Night Springs and Lake House, though the details on both are very thin. And then there's the mid-credits scene that recontextualizes a lot. The mid-credits focuses on Alan's wife Alice. Alice had been working on creating a new photo exhibition and a documentary about her work, focused around being haunted by visions of Alan appearing in her apartment. As I mentioned earlier, Alan thought it was Scratch attacking Alice, but by the end of his story, he realizes that it was his repeated attempts to reach her in that old apartment causing her visions of him. The documentary concludes with the revelation that Alice took her own life to escape the torment. Or so we thought. The mid-credits scene reveals Alice actually faked her death after realizing that her experiences in Bright Falls during the original Alan Wake were real, and that Alan has been trapped in the Dark Place ever since. This is actually referencing plot points to Remedy's other game, Control, and its AWE expansion. Alice had interacted with the FBC in the aftermath of the first Alan Wake story. It's this visit to the FBC headquarters, the oldest house in New York, which unlocks her memories of the Dark Place. In AWE, it's heavily implied that these events are a part of a story Alan is writing from the Dark Place, with new manuscript pages appearing in the oldest house during the DLC. The mid-credit scene makes it clear that Alice's apparent suicide was actually her returning to the Dark Place, this time with a plan. Alice led Alan to believe that she had committed suicide to set him on the path to connecting with Saga in the first place. It was also Alice who called Saga and helped lead her through the Dark Place, and it seems Alice means to finally help save Alan once and for all. How she's going to do that exactly isn't clear, but she thinks her intimate knowledge of the Dark Place will give her an edge. The final moment of the mid-credits scene sees Alan waking up from Saga shooting him to utter the line, "It's not a loop, it's a spiral." We know that Alan called himself from another point in the story to instruct himself to leave Alice's photos in the shoebox. Unlike other parts of the loop, we haven't seen that call being placed yet, so whatever point in the story it's from, it's beyond what we've actually played in the game. The spiral line also carries some implications. If you watch Tom Zane's film, Nightless Night, when it plays at the conclusion of the cinema section of the game, you'll hear that line spoken again by the film's version of Alex Casey. The film is about Casey being sacrificed by a cult led by Barbara Jagger, the woman he loves. She, however, loves Zane. Barbara manipulates Casey into becoming a ritual sacrifice to release Zane from the dark place. When Casey says it's not a loop, it's a spiral, think of it meaning like a spiral staircase, and that Casey is being sent downward into the dark place to replace Zane. For Alan, it's not a loop, it's a spiral, could mean the opposite, that Alan can use the loop to ascend out of the dark place, come up the spiral staircase, if he knows how to climb it, which Nightless Night implies that somebody will need to replace Alan in order to get him out, just as Casey was used to get Zane out. We could also be getting some hints about another antagonist for the future of the story, Tom Zane. Alan confronts and shoots Zane during the story, but like Alan, Zane apparently doesn't stay dead. We know he's been making his own attempts to escape the dark place, and that he went so far as to work with Mr. Scratch to that end. So what about Saga? Her fate is left ambiguous at the end of Alan Wake 2. At the very least, she seems to still be in the dark place with Casey, and it's not especially clear how she would get out. There's a hanging thread that seems poised to deal with that too, though. After the summoning ritual and Scratch throwing Saga into the dark place, Tor and Odin wade into Cauldron Lake after her. It seems like they're headed in to help get her back out, but the rest of the game goes on without seeing the old gods of Asgard again, so they're down there in the dark place as far as we know. It doesn't seem like much of a stretch to guess that Saga's story will be continued in one of the DLC editions, with Tor and Odin playing a role in finally helping Saga make her escape with Casey. And let's not forget about Warlin Door and Sheriff Tim Breaker as well, who seem to have roles yet to play. The impression of Door throughout Alan Wake 2 is that he's aware of Alan's story and taking part in it willingly. It is also never said plainly, but it's very heavily implied that he is Saga's father, who in the real world was absent for almost all of her life, and that while Saga has inherited the power to resist the Dark Presence's manipulation from her mother's side of the family, she inherited the potential to navigate the Dark Place's labyrinthine layout from him. So there are plenty of elements for the story to deal with, and we know there's a fair amount of story yet to be told. As of right now, though, the conclusion is that Alan sacrificed himself to remain in the Dark Place in order to save Saga, Casey, Logan, and Bright Falls. What we still don't know is whether he was successful, but we do know that there are people still looking to help him. There's enough there to merit Alan Wake potentially being a trilogy. It's just a matter of whether or not we'll have to wait another 13 years for the next installment. And of course, some of this may be resolved in the next Control game, which is confirmed to be in development, as well as any other Remedy Connected Universe titles that the developer is working on. What are your theories and takeaways on the story of Alan Wake 2? Let us know in the comments below, and for everything to do with Alan Wake 2 and the Remedy Connected Universe, stay tuned to GameSpot.